The autumn wind of 1849 carried the scent of sagebrush and wood smoke across the Nebraska territory, but 34-year-old Margaret Holloway couldn't focus on the familiar smells of the frontier. She pressed her weathered hands against the canvas wall of her covered wagon, listening to the sounds that would haunt her dreams for years to come, the desperate cries of newborn babies echoing through the thin October air, and the broken voice of wagon train captain Thomas Brennan as he made an announcement that would shock even the hardened pioneers of the Oregon Trail. $20 for the pair, Brennan's voice cracked as he addressed the circle of wagons that had been their traveling community for the past 6 months. I can't care for them. Sarah's gone, and I've got 43 families depending on me to get them to Oregon Territory before the snows trap us in the mountains. Margaret's heart clenched as she realized what she was hearing. Thomas Brennan, the man who had led their wagon train safely across 1,000 miles of treacherous frontier, was auctioning his own children, twin babies not yet 3 days old, born into a world that had immediately robbed them of their mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Holloway had joined the Oregon Trail wagon train in Independence, Missouri, 6 months earlier, with dreams that now seemed as distant as the mountains they were approaching. At 34, she was older than most pioneer women, her auburn hair already showing threads of silver that caught the prairie sunlight during their long days of travel. Her husband Daniel had died of consumption 2 years prior, leaving her with a modest inheritance and a house in St. Louis that felt more like a tomb than a home. But it wasn't grief alone that had driven Margaret to sell everything she owned and join Thomas Brennan's wagon train bound for the Oregon Territory. It was the deeper ache that had defined her adult life, the knowledge that her body would never carry the children she and Daniel had dreamed of having. 15 years of marriage had brought them joy in each other's company, but month after month, year after year, Margaret's arms remained empty while other women in their St. Louis community celebrated the arrivals of sons and daughters. The frontier represented a chance to start over, to find purpose in a place where survival mattered, more than social expectations, where a woman's worth wasn't measured solely by her ability to bear children. Margaret had skills that frontier communities needed. She could read and write, having been educated by her father, who had served as a schoolmaster in Ohio before moving the family to Missouri. She could tend to the sick, having learned herb, law from her grandmother, and practical nursing from caring for Daniel during his final illness. Most importantly, she possessed the kind of steady determination that the Oregon Territory's harsh realities would demand. The wagon train itself was a community of 47 families, each drawn to the promise of free land and new opportunities. In the Pacific Northwest, there were the Kowalski family from Illinois, with their 4 young children and dreams of establishing a farm in the Willamette Valley. The elderly Reverend Samuel Morrison and his wife Ruth, who planned to establish a church in whatever settlement would have them. The Hendricks brothers, twins in their 20s, who had pooled their resources to purchase the equipment and livestock necessary for the journey. At the center of this traveling community was Thomas Brennan, a man whose reputation for leading wagon trains safely to Oregon had made him the natural choice when the families gathered in Independence to organize their journey. At 28, Thomas possessed the unique combination of frontier experience and natural leadership that such expeditions required. He knew every water source between Missouri and Oregon, every river crossing, every mountain pass that could make the difference between life and death for the families who trusted him with their lives. Thomas had made the journey to Oregon twice before, first as a young man seeking his fortune in the gold fields of California, then as a guide for other wagon trains. But this third journey was different. He was traveling with his wife Sarah, a gentlewoman from Missouri, who had married him the previous spring, with dreams of establishing a new life in the territory where land was free to those brave enough to claim it. Sarah Brennan had been the heart of the wagon train's social fabric during their months on the trail. She organized the evening gatherings, where families shared news and stories around the communal fires. She tended to sick children when their mothers were overwhelmed with the demands of trail life. She had even helped Margaret adjust to the rhythms of wagon train living, teaching her how to cook over open fires and how to preserve food during the long stretches between supply stops. Margaret had grown particularly close to Sarah during the journey, perhaps because both women understood what it meant to face uncertainty about their futures. Sarah was pregnant with her first child, due to arrive sometime after they reached Oregon Territory, and she often confided her fears about giving birth so far from civilization, far from the midwives and doctors who might help if complications arose. "I keep telling myself that pioneer women have been having babies on the frontier for decades," Sarah had said one evening as they walked beside the slow-moving wagons, the setting sun painting the prairie grass gold around them. "But sometimes I wake up at night wondering what will happen if something goes wrong, if the baby comes early, or if I need help that Thomas can't provide." Margaret had offered what comfort she could, sharing the herb lore she'd learned from her grandmother and promising to assist with the birth when the time came. But privately, she shared Sarah's concerns. The frontier was unforgiving, especially to women and children. They had already passed too many graves marked with simple wooden crosses, reminders of the pioneers who had started the journey west but never completed it. The wagon train's daily routine had become as familiar as breathing. During their 6 months on the trail, they rose before dawn, breaking camp and hitching their oxen while the morning air was still cool enough to make the work bearable. The wagons rolled out in a predetermined order, with Thomas riding ahead to scout the trail and ensure they were following the safest route toward their destination. Margaret's wagon was positioned near the middle of the train, close enough to the families with children that she could help with medical emergencies or other crises that arose during the long days of travel. Her oxen, a steady pair named Buck and Bell, had proven reliable despite their advanced age, and her wagon carried not just her own possessions, but also medical supplies that she shared freely with other families. The landscape through which they traveled had changed dramatically during their months on the trail. The rolling hills and forests of Missouri had given way to the vast grasslands of Kansas and Nebraska, where the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and the sky dominated everything else. They had forded rivers that could sweep away wagons and livestock in a matter of minutes, crossed deserts where water was more precious than gold, and climbed mountain passes where a single misstep could send a wagon tumbling into the valleys below. But it was in the Nebraska Territory, with the Rocky Mountains visible as a blue line on the western horizon, that their traveling community faced its greatest test. Sarah Brennan had gone into labor during what should have been a routine day of travel, her cries of pain echoing across the prairie as Thomas frantically unhitched their wagon and tried to create some privacy for his wife's ordeal. Margaret had been among the first to respond to Thomas's desperate calls for help, bringing her medical supplies and what experience she had with difficult births. But even as she worked alongside the other women of the wagon train, she could see that something was terribly wrong. Sarah's labor was progressing too quickly, and there were complications that their frontier medical knowledge couldn't address. The twins, 2 boys, arrived just as the sun was setting on October 15th, their cries piercing the evening air as the wagon train's families gathered in anxious silence around the Brennan wagon. For a few moments, it seemed as though Sarah's fears had been unfounded, that she and Thomas would welcome their sons into the world and continue the journey to Oregon as a growing family. But Sarah's bleeding wouldn't stop, despite everything. Margaret and the other women tried, Pressure, elevation, herb tinctures that were supposed to help with hemorrhaging, Sarah's life slipped away even as she held her newborn sons for the first and last time. Her final words were whispered to Thomas, instructions about caring for the babies that she would never see grow up, requests that he find good homes for them if he couldn't manage alone. Thomas Brennan's grief was as vast as the prairie sky above. Them. He had lost not just his wife, but also his vision of their future together in Oregon Territory. The man who had confidently led 47 families across 1,000 miles of dangerous trail suddenly couldn't imagine how he would care for 2 infants while maintaining his responsibilities to the wagon train. The practical realities were overwhelming. Newborn twins required constant attention, feeding every few hours, diaper changes, comfort when they cried. Thomas had no experience with infant care, and the demands of leading the wagon train left him no time to learn. They were still weeks away from Oregon Territory, with difficult mountain passes ahead and the constant threat of early snow that could trap them in the wilderness. "I can't do both," he had said to Margaret and Reverend Morrison on the morning after Sarah's death, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "I can't care for babies and get these families safely to Oregon. People are depending on me to make decisions that keep them alive. If I'm distracted by crying babies or trying to figure out feeding schedules, someone's going to die on these mountain passes." The solution he had reached was practical but heartbreaking. He would find families within the wagon train willing to adopt the twins, offering payment to help offset the additional burden of caring for infants on the trail. It was, he insisted, what Sarah would have wanted. She would have chosen the baby's survival over sentimentality, would have wanted them raised by families who could provide the attention and care they needed. But as Margaret listened to Thomas announce the auction of his own children, she felt something more complex than simple sympathy. She felt a profound recognition of opportunity, a sense that the universe was offering her the chance to finally hold the children she had always dreamed of having. These babies needed a mother, and she needed children to love and raise. The transaction Thomas proposed was presented as a practical necessity, but for Margaret it represented the possibility of transforming her greatest sorrow into her greatest joy. The other families gathered around the communal fire that evening were not entirely surprised by Thomas's announcement. The practical demands of trail life often required difficult decisions, and they had all witnessed the impossibility of his situation. Some expressed sympathy for his loss and understanding of his dilemma. Others whispered among themselves about the moral implications of selling children, even under such desperate circumstances. But Margaret Holloway said nothing that evening, her mind already working through the possibilities and challenges that adopting the twins would present. She had the financial resources. Her inheritance from Daniel would easily cover Thomas's asking price and the additional expenses that 2 infants would require. She had the practical skills necessary for child-rearing, having helped care for her younger siblings during her own childhood in Ohio. Most importantly, she had something that none of the other potential buyers possessed: the desperate longing of a woman who had spent 15 years dreaming of the children she would never bear naturally. For Margaret, these twins represented not just babies who needed homes, but the answer to prayers she had stopped believing would ever be answered. As the wagon train settled into its evening routine around her, Margaret Holloway began planning how she would approach Thomas Brennan about his sons. She would need to convince him that she could provide not just adequate care, but genuine love for the children who had entered the world as orphans. She would need to prove that a woman traveling alone could successfully raise twins while completing the journey to Oregon Territory. But more than anything, she would need to find the courage to speak up before someone else claimed the children who might finally fill the emptiness that had defined her adult life. Tomorrow morning, She would make her bid for Thomas Brennan's sons, and with it she would bet everything on the possibility that love could triumph over the practical difficulties that everyone else saw as insurmountable obstacles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The October dawn brought frost that sparkled like diamonds on the canvas wagon tops, but Margaret Holloway barely noticed the beauty as she prepared her morning meal over the flickering campfire. Sleep had eluded her completely during the night, her mind churning with plans and possibilities as the twin babies' cries echoed periodically across the camp. Each wail seemed to pierce straight through her heart, a sound that spoke to every maternal instinct she had spent 15 years learning to suppress. Thomas Brennan had spent the night in the Kowalski wagon, having accepted their offer of temporary shelter while he figured out how to manage his impossible situation. The twins remained in his own wagon, tended by a rotation of women from the train who took turns feeding them with milk from the few dairy cows that had survived the journey thus far. But everyone knew this arrangement was temporary. The women had their own children and responsibilities, and the demands of caring for newborn twins while maintaining the grueling pace of trail life would quickly become unsustainable. Margaret could hear the hushed conversations taking place around other campfires as families discussed Thomas's announcement from the previous evening. The Hendricks brothers were debating whether their bachelor household could manage infant care alongside their plans to establish a cattle ranch in Oregon. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, a widow traveling with her teenage daughter, was calculating whether her limited resources could stretch to feed 2 additional mouths. The Reverend Morrison and his wife Ruth were engaged in what appeared to be an intense theological discussion about the morality of purchasing children, even under such desperate circumstances. But it was the conversation taking place at the Campbell family's wagon that made Margaret's blood run cold with urgency. James Campbell, a successful merchant from Kentucky, was speaking in the confident tones of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. $20 is nothing, Campbell was saying to his wife Adelaide as they prepared their breakfast. We can easily afford to take both boys, and they'll be useful hands on the farm once they're old enough to work. Good strong stock, judging by Thomas's build. And Sarah came from hardy Missouri farming people. Adelaide Campbell nodded her agreement, though Margaret detected reluctance in her voice. The twins would give our Mary playmates close to her own age, she said, and you're right that we have the resources to provide for them properly. Margaret felt her heart sink as she realized the Campbell family represented exactly the kind of stable, prosperous household that Thomas would naturally favor for his sons. James Campbell owned one of the largest and best-equipped wagons in the train, pulled by a team of 6 oxen rather than the standard 4. His family traveled with servants and enough supplies to weather any crisis the trail might present. From a practical standpoint, they could offer the twins security and opportunity that Margaret, traveling alone with modest resources, could never match. But Margaret also knew things about the Campbell family that might not be immediately apparent to Thomas in his grief-stricken state. She had observed James Campbell's treatment of his hired hands during their months on the trail, the way he worked them from before dawn until after dark, the casual cruelty with which he spoke to anyone he considered beneath his social station. She had seen how he treated his own 8-year-old daughter Mary, demanding absolute obedience and showing little affection or patience for childhood mistakes. The Campbell household operated like a business enterprise rather than a family, with Adelaide managing domestic affairs with military efficiency, while James focused on expanding his wealth and influence. Taking in the twins would be, for them, an investment in future labor rather than an act of love. The boys would be fed and clothed and educated to be useful, but they would never know the kind of unconditional maternal love that Margaret ached to provide. As the morning progressed and the wagon train prepared for another day's travel, Margaret noticed other developments that increased her sense of urgency. Word of Thomas's situation had apparently spread beyond their immediate traveling community. They had encountered other westward-bound groups at the Platte River crossing 2 days earlier, and some of those travelers were now approaching the Brennan wagon with obvious interest in the twins. A family named the Hutchinsons, traveling with a smaller group bound for California's gold fields, had ridden over from their camp a mile downstream. Margaret watched as Mrs. Hutchinson examined the twins with the calculating eye of someone evaluating livestock, checking their reflexes and commenting on their apparent health and vigor. Her husband spoke with Thomas in low tones about practical arrangements, clearly viewing the transaction as a straightforward business deal. Twins are actually more efficient than single births, Mrs. Hutchinson was explaining to Thomas. They can keep each other company as they grow, require less individual attention. We lost our own boy to cholera in Kansas, so we have experience with infant care. $20 seems reasonable for the pair. Margaret felt a growing sense of panic as she realized how quickly the situation was moving toward a conclusion that would put the twins beyond her reach forever. Thomas was clearly eager to resolve the matter before the wagon train resumed its westward journey. Every hour they delayed increased the risk of being caught by early winter storms in the mountain passes ahead. But Margaret also began to notice cracks in Thomas's resolve that suggested his decision wasn't as final as his public announcements made it appear. She observed him standing beside his wagon in the early morning light, staring down at the sleeping twins with an expression of profound anguish. When one of the babies stirred and made soft noises, Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward them before he caught himself and stepped back, as if physical contact would make his planned separation even more unbearable. During the morning's preparations for travel, Margaret also witnessed a telling exchange between Thomas and his best friend on the wagon train, a man named Robert Hayes, who had known him since childhood in Missouri. Hayes was attempting to convince Thomas to reconsider his decision, arguing that there might be other solutions to the impossible situation. "Tom, you're making this choice while you're still deep in grief," Hayes said as they checked the harnesses on Thomas's oxen team. "Sarah's been gone less than 3 days. Maybe if you gave yourself time to think, you'd find a way to manage both responsibilities." Thomas's response revealed the depth of his internal conflict. "Every minute I spend thinking about keeping them is another minute I'm not focusing on the 47 families counting on me to get them through those mountain passes alive," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't afford to be distracted when people's lives depend on my decisions, and I can't ask the other women to keep caring for my boys indefinitely. They have their own children and their own struggles." "What if someone offered to help more permanently?" Hayes pressed. "What if one of the women on the train wanted to take responsibility for the twins without payment, out of genuine care rather than business arrangement?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands working automatically with the leather straps and metal buckles that secured the oxen's harnesses. "I suppose I'd have to consider what was truly best for the boys," he finally said. "But it would have to be someone I trusted completely, someone I knew would love them as their own and give them the kind of life Sarah wanted for them." Margaret felt her heart racing as she overheard this conversation from her position near her own wagon. Thomas was clearly not as committed to the auction as he appeared publicly. He was a grieving father, desperate for alternatives, willing to consider options that prioritized his son's welfare over financial compensation. If she could convince him that she offered genuine love rather than business transaction, she might still have a chance to claim the children who had already captured her heart. but Margaret also realized she would need to act quickly and decisively. The Campbell family's resources and social standing gave them significant advantages in any negotiation, and the Hutchinson family's experience with infant loss and survival might appeal to Thomas's practical concerns about the twins' immediate needs. Her own qualifications, medical knowledge, educational background, financial stability, were solid but not obviously superior to what other potential adopters could offer. The key, Margaret realized, would be demonstrating her emotional connection to the twins and her understanding of what Thomas was experiencing as a grieving father. She had cared for Daniel through his final illness, had experienced the helplessness of watching someone she loved slip away despite her best efforts to save them. She understood the particular anguish of being forced to make impossible choices when grief made clear thinking nearly impossible. As the wagon train completed its morning preparations and began forming up for another day's westward travel, Margaret made her decision. She would approach Thomas directly before the day's journey began, and while he was still privately wrestling with his choice. She would speak to him not as a potential buyer in a business transaction, but as someone who understood loss and who could offer his sons the kind of maternal love that no amount of money could purchase. Margaret gathered her courage and walked toward the Brennan wagon, where Thomas was making final adjustments to his equipment while the twins slept in a makeshift cradle that Sarah had sewn during the early months of their journey. The sight of that carefully crafted baby bed, with its delicate embroidered flowers and tiny quilted blankets, almost brought tears to Margaret's eyes as she realized how much hope and love Sarah had invested in preparing for children she would never see grow up. "Thomas," Margaret called softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping babies. "Could I speak with you for a moment before we begin today's travel?" Thomas looked up from his work, his face showing the exhaustion and strain of the past 3 days. His clothes were rumpled from sleeping in the Kowalski wagon, his hair uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed from grief and sleepless nights. But Margaret could also see something else in his expression. A desperate hope that someone might offer him an alternative to the choice that was tearing him apart. "Of course, Margaret," Thomas replied, setting down the leather strap he had been adjusting. "I've been meaning to thank you for all your help with Sarah during the birth. You did everything anyone could have done." Margaret felt her throat tighten at the mention of Sarah's final hours, but she forced herself to focus on the conversation that would determine the twins' future. "Thomas, I want to talk to you about the boys," she said gently. "I know you're planning to find families to adopt them, but I want you to consider another possibility." Thomas's attention sharpened, and Margaret could see both hope and wariness in his expression. "What kind of possibility?" he asked. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either open the door to the future she dreamed of or close it forever. "I want to adopt them myself," she said simply. "Both boys. I want to raise them as my own sons and love them the way Sarah would have wanted them to be loved." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch across the entire prairie, broken only by the soft breathing of the sleeping twins and the distant sounds of the wagon train, preparing for another day's journey toward Oregon territory. Thomas. Brennan's weathered hands stilled completely on the wagon's wooden sideboard as Margaret's words hung in the crisp morning air between them. For a moment, the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the familiar creaking of leather and wood, as other families completed their preparations for the day's journey. One of the twins stirred in his makeshift cradle, making the soft, mewling sounds that newborns use to communicate their needs, and Thomas's eyes immediately shifted to his sons with an expression of such raw longing that Margaret felt her heart break for him. "You want to adopt them both?" Thomas asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, do you understand what you're saying?" These are newborn babies who will need constant care for months, maybe years. You're traveling alone with no husband to help you, no family support, the trail ahead. He gestured vaguely toward the western horizon where the Rocky Mountains waited like blue shadows. We've got mountain passes to cross, river crossings that could kill us all if we make a mistake. How could you possibly manage infant twins and still survive the journey? Margaret had spent the sleepless night preparing for exactly these questions, but hearing them spoken aloud by Thomas made the magnitude of her proposal feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. She was asking to take responsibility for two helpless human beings while navigating some of the most dangerous terrain in North America, with winter approaching and no guarantee that any of them would survive to see Oregon territory. "I've been thinking about nothing else since yesterday evening," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're right that it won't be easy, but Thomas, I have advantages that some of the other families don't. I have medical training, I help deliver these boys, and I know how to care for sick children. I have enough money saved to buy whatever supplies they'll need, and my wagon is large enough to set up a proper nursery area." Thomas shook his head, his expression showing the internal war between hope and practicality. "Money and medical knowledge aren't enough, Margaret. Babies need milk every few hours, day and night. They need clean diapers, warm clothing, constant attention. When they're sick or crying, you can't just set them aside to deal with wagon repairs, or river crossings, or the 100 other emergencies that happen on the trail. Then I'll adapt," Margaret said simply. "Other women have managed children on wagon trains before. Mrs. Kowalski has 4 little ones, and the Patterson family brought their baby daughter. If they can do it with their own families to manage, I can do it with just the twins to focus on." But even as she spoke, Margaret could see that Thomas was thinking of something more specific than general trail difficulties. His gaze kept drifting to where James Campbell was hitching his oxen team, the wealthy merchant's servants bustling around his elaborate wagon setup with military efficiency. Campbell represented security in a way that Margaret, despite her determination, simply couldn't match. "The Campbell family has made an offer," Thomas said reluctantly. "James came to me this morning before dawn. He's willing to pay $30 for both boys, and he's got the resources to give them everything they could ever need: education, opportunity, security. His wagon is like a mobile house. He's got spare oxen in case some go lame, enough food stored to last through a hard winter, even books and writing materials for schooling." Margaret felt her stomach clench as she realized the true scope of what she was competing against. $30 was a significant sum, more than many families on the trail had in total resources, but more than the money Campbell could offer. The twins a level of material security that would appeal to any father trying to ensure his children's survival and prosperity. "Thomas," Margaret said carefully, "have you spent time observing how James Campbell treats the people under his care? His hired hands, his servants, even his own daughter?" Thomas's eyebrows drew together in a frown. "What do you mean?" Margaret chose her words carefully, knowing that direct criticism of another family could backfire if Thomas interpreted it as jealousy or desperation. "I've noticed that Mr. Campbell views relationships in terms of utility and profit. His workers are valuable to him as long as they're productive, but he shows little concern for their well-being beyond what affects their ability to work. Mary Campbell is a lovely child, but she seems frightened of disappointing her father. She's always so careful, so anxious to please." "That's just good discipline," Thomas said, but Margaret could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Children need structure and expectations. They need love too," Margaret replied gently. "Thomas, if you give your sons to the Campbell family, they'll be fed and clothed and educated, yes. But they'll be raised as investments in the family's future prosperity, not as children who are valued for themselves. When they're old enough to work, they'll be expected to earn their keep. When they make mistakes, they'll be punished for costing the family money, rather than taught with patience and understanding. One of the twins began to cry, a thin, demanding wail that spoke of hunger and discomfort. Without thinking, Margaret moved toward the cradle, her hands automatically reaching for the baby in the universal gesture of a woman responding to a child's need. She caught herself just as Thomas stepped forward, both of them freezing in an awkward moment of uncertainty about who had the right to comfort the crying infant. "Go ahead," Thomas said quietly, stepping back. "You've been helping care for them since they were born." Margaret lifted the crying baby. She thought it might be the slightly smaller twin, though it was difficult to tell them apart so early, and instinctively began the gentle, swaying motion that seemed to calm distressed infants. The baby's cries softened to whimpers, and then to the contented breathing of a child who felt safe in caring arms. Thomas watched this interaction with an expression that Margaret couldn't quite read. "You're natural with them," he observed. "Sarah noticed that during the birth. She said you had the hands of someone meant to be a mother." The mention of Sarah's words brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes, but also a surge of determination. "Sarah wanted her sons to be loved, Thomas. That's what she whispered to you in her final moments, wasn't it? Not that they should be wealthy or socially prominent, but that they should be safe and loved and raised by someone who would see them as the gifts they are." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Margaret holding his son and the bustling activity of the Campbell family's elaborate wagon setup. "The Hutchinson family has also made an offer," he said finally. $25, and they've raised children before. They lost their own boy to disease, so they understand what it means to value what you have while you have it. Margaret felt her heart sink further as she realized how many attractive options Thomas was weighing. The Hutchinson family's experience with child loss might actually make them more appealing than her own childless state. They had proven they could love and care for children, even children who weren't their biological offspring. "What do they want from the boys?" Margaret asked, still gently rocking the baby in her arms. "What kind of life are they planning to give them?" "They're bound for California's gold country," Thomas replied. "They think the boys could be useful in mining operations once they're old enough. Gold mining is dangerous work, but it can be profitable if you're lucky and careful." Margaret suppressed a shudder at the thought of Sarah's precious sons spending their childhoods in mining camps, being raised to see their value, primarily in terms of their physical strength and endurance. And if they're not lucky, if the gold runs out or the mines prove too dangerous? Thomas's expression showed that he'd considered these same questions. "I suppose they'd find other work. The Hutchinsons seem like decent people, and they've promised to treat the boys well." "Thomas," Margaret said, shifting the baby to her shoulder where his tiny fist grabbed at her hair, "you're thinking about this like a business transaction. You're weighing offers and calculating advantages, but these are your sons we're talking about, Sarah's sons. What would she want for them?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow, and Margaret saw his careful composure crack for the first time since she'd approached him. "She'd want them to be happy," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "She'd want them to know they were loved, to grow up feeling safe and valued. She'd want them to have the kind of childhood we never had. We were both orphans, you know. We both grew up in households where we were fed and sheltered, but never really belonged anywhere." Margaret felt a surge of understanding and compassion for Thomas's impossible position. He wasn't just trying to find homes for his sons. He was trying to ensure they never experienced the particular kind of loneliness that came from being unwanted children in other people's houses. "Then you understand why money isn't the most important consideration," Margaret said softly. "Thomas, I can't offer your sons the material advantages that the Campbell family can provide. I can't guarantee they'll be wealthy or socially prominent. But I can promise you that they'll be loved completely, unconditionally, the way Sarah would have loved them herself." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to his son, nestled contentedly in her arms, then back. "Again, you really want this," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "This isn't pity or charity. You actually want to raise my boys as your own." "I've wanted children my entire adult life," Margaret replied simply. "Daniel and I tried for 15 years to have a family, and when he died, I thought that dream died with him. But seeing your sons, holding them, caring for them these past few days, Thomas, it feels like coming home. It feels like what I was meant to do with my life." The baby in her arms stirred and made soft, contented sounds, and Margaret looked down at his tiny face with an expression of such pure maternal love that Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was how Sarah would have looked at their sons, he realized. This was the kind of devoted, instinctive care that money couldn't buy and business arrangements couldn't guarantee. The trail ahead is going to be harder than anything we've faced. "So far," Thomas said quietly. "The mountain passes, the river crossings, the weather. Margaret, if something happens to you, those boys would be orphaned completely. At least, with a family like the Campbells, there are multiple adults to ensure their survival." Margaret nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern. "You're right that traveling alone with infants involves risks that a larger family wouldn't face. But Thomas, I'm not as helpless as you might think. I've managed my own wagon and livestock for 6 months of trail travel. I've treated injuries and illnesses for families throughout the train. I've proven that I can handle frontier life independently." "But babies are different," Thomas protested. "They can't wait while you deal with emergencies or crisis situations. They need attention every few hours, no matter what else is happening." "Then I'll give them that attention," Margaret said firmly. "I'll organize my entire life around their needs, the way any mother does. Thomas, what you're really asking is whether I love them enough to sacrifice everything else for their well-being. And the answer is yes, absolutely, completely yes." Thomas looked toward the horizon where the Rocky Mountains waited, their snow-capped peaks visible even from this distance. Soon the wagon train would need to begin climbing into terrain where every decision could mean the difference between life and death for the families depending on his leadership. But right now, in this moment, he had to make a decision that would determine his son's entire future, and Margaret Holloway was asking him to bet their lives on love rather than security, on faith rather than financial advantage. The choice that would change everything was about to be made. The morning sun climbed higher over the Nebraska territory as Thomas Brennan stood frozen between two futures for his sons. Around them, the wagon train's 47 families completed their daily preparations with the efficient urgency of people who understood that every hour of delay brought them closer to being trapped by winter in the mountain passes ahead. But Thomas felt as though time had stopped completely, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like the vast prairie sky above. Margaret continued to hold his son with the natural grace of a woman born to motherhood, and Thomas found himself studying her face as she gazed down at the baby. There was something in her expression that reminded him powerfully of Sarah during her pregnancy, a look of profound wonder and protective love that transcended all practical considerations. It was the look of someone who saw children not as responsibilities to be managed, but as miracles to be cherished. "Give me until noon," Thomas said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to think about this properly, and I need to check on something before I make a final decision." Margaret felt her heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. Thomas wasn't saying yes, but he wasn't saying no either. He was giving her a chance to prove herself worthy of the trust she was asking him to place in her. "Of course," she said, gently returning the baby to his makeshift cradle. "Take whatever time you need. This decision will affect the rest of their lives." As Margaret walked back toward her own wagon, she noticed that news of her proposal had apparently spread through the train's informal communication network. Mrs. Kowalski intercepted her near the circle of oxen, her round face creased with concern and curiosity. "Margaret, dear," the older woman said, falling into step beside her, "Anna Campbell mentioned that you're thinking of taking on Thomas's boys yourself. Are you certain you've thought this through completely? 2 babies are an enormous responsibility, even for a married woman with family support." Margaret appreciated Mrs. Kowalski's genuine concern, but she also detected the underlying assumption that had plagued her throughout her adult life. The belief that a childless woman couldn't possibly understand what child-rearing actually involved. "I understand it won't be easy," Margaret replied diplomatically, "but I believe I can provide what those boys need most, which is someone who will love them completely." "Love is important, certainly," Mrs. Kowalski agreed, "but it doesn't fill empty stomachs or prevent sickness or keep babies warm during mountain blizzards. The Campbell family could give those children advantages that you simply can't match, dear. Sometimes the loving thing to do is recognize our limitations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Campbell himself, his expensive boots crunching through the frost-covered grass as he approached Margaret with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the discussion, and Mrs. Kowalski stepped back with the deference that Campbell's wealth and social status commanded, even in the supposedly egalitarian environment of the wagon train. "Miss Holloway," Campbell said, his tone cordial but carrying an undercurrent of calculation, "I understand you've expressed interest in adopting the Brennan twins. I wonder if we might discuss the situation frankly, as reasonable adults who both want what's best for those unfortunate children." Margaret felt her spine stiffen at Campbell's phrasing. The twins weren't unfortunate children. They were precious babies who had lost their mother, and the distinction mattered enormously in terms of how they would be viewed and treated throughout their childhood. "Certainly, Mr. Campbell," she replied carefully, "though I'm not sure what there is to discuss. Thomas will make whatever decision he feels is best for his sons." Campbell's smile was practiced and slightly condescending. "Indeed he will, and as a practical man facing enormous challenges, I'm confident he'll recognize the advantages my family can offer. Miss Holloway, I don't question your good intentions, but surely you can see that raising twin infants alone, while traveling through some of the most dangerous territory in North America, is simply not realistic. Other women have managed children on wagon trains," Margaret pointed out, echoing her earlier argument to Thomas. "Other women have had husbands to share the burden," Campbell countered smoothly. "They've had family members to help with emergencies, financial resources to weather unexpected crises. You're proposing to take on double the normal responsibility with half the normal support. It's not fair to those children to risk their welfare on such an uncertain arrangement." Margaret felt her temper beginning to rise at Campbell's patronizing tone, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting into an argument with him would only reinforce his characterization of her as an emotional woman making impractical decisions. "Mr. Campbell, what exactly are you proposing to do with the twins if Thomas accepts your offer?" Campbell's expression shifted slightly, revealing the calculating businessman beneath his veneer of paternal concern. "They'll be raised as members of my family, naturally, given the same education and opportunities as my own daughter. When they're old enough, they'll help with family business interests. We're planning to establish trading posts and eventually a shipping company in Oregon Territory. Hard-working, educated young men will have excellent prospects in a growing territory." And if they're not interested in business, Margaret asked, if they want to pursue other paths in life? Campbell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Young men need guidance in making practical decisions about their futures. Dreams and childhood fancies are luxuries that frontier life rarely permits. They'll learn to appreciate the security and opportunity that our family can provide. Margaret heard the implicit threat in Campbell's words. The twins would be expected to serve the family's interests regardless of their own desires or inclinations. They would be treated well as long as they remained useful and obedient, but their individual happiness and fulfillment would always be secondary to the Campbell family's prosperity. While this conversation was taking place, Thomas Brennan was conducting his own investigation into Margaret's character and capabilities. He had spent the morning speaking quietly with various members of the Wagon train who had observed her behavior during their months of travel together. What he learned gradually shifted his understanding of Margaret from lonely widow-seeking children to remarkably capable woman who had been helping others throughout their journey. Reverend Morrison described how Margaret had sat up all night with his wife Ruth during a bout of fever, applying cool compresses and administering herbal remedies that had almost certainly saved the older woman's life. "She has genuine healing skills," the minister told Thomas earnestly. "Not just book learning, but the instincts and patience that make the difference between someone who knows medicine and someone who can actually help people." Robert Hayes mentioned Margaret's calm competence during a crisis 3 weeks earlier when the Pattersons' wagon had broken an axle in the middle of a river crossing. While everyone else was panicking about the rising water and the current, Margaret waded right in and helped organize the rescue, Hayes recalled. She knew exactly what needed to be done and did it without hesitation. That's not the behavior of someone who falls apart under pressure. Even more telling was his conversation with 8-year-old Mary Campbell, who had apparently spent considerable time observing Margaret during their months of travel. When Thomas gently asked the little girl what she thought of Miss Holloway, Mary's face lit up with genuine affection. "She tells the best stories," Mary said enthusiastically, "and she always has time to answer questions, even when she's busy with her own work. She taught me how to identify different plants and which ones can help when people are sick. She never gets angry when I make mistakes learning things." Thomas found this last comment particularly revealing, especially when compared to his observations of James Campbell's impatient reactions to his daughter's childhood mistakes and natural curiosity. Margaret apparently possessed the kind of gentle patience that would allow children to learn and grow without fear of harsh criticism or punishment. But the most convincing testimony came from an unexpected source: Samuel Patterson, the father of the baby daughter who had been born during the early weeks of their journey. Patterson pulled Thomas aside as they prepared their wagons for the day's travel. "Tom, I hear you're considering giving your boys to Margaret Holloway," Patterson said without preamble. "I want you to know that woman saved my daughter's life during the first month on the trail. Little Emma stopped breathing one night, just stopped, for no reason anyone could figure out. Margaret worked over her for hours, doing things with pressure points and breathing techniques that none of the rest of us had ever seen. She brought Emma back when we thought we'd lost her." Patterson's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. "But that's not the most important part. For weeks afterward, Margaret checked on Emma every single day, sometimes multiple times, making sure she was thriving and developing normally. She never asked for payment or thanks. She just cared about that baby like Emma was her own daughter. If you want your boys raised by someone who will love them the way a mother should, you won't find anyone better than Margaret Holloway." As noon approached and Thomas prepared to announce his decision, he found himself thinking not about financial offers or material advantages, but about the kind of childhood he wanted his sons to experience. He and Sarah had both grown up as unwanted children in households where they were fed and sheltered but never truly loved. They had promised each other that their own children would know from their earliest memories that they were valued for themselves, not for what they could contribute to family prosperity. Thomas walked slowly back toward his wagon, where Margaret waited with obvious anxiety while the Campbell and Hutchinson families hovered nearby with equally obvious expectation. The twins were awake now, making the soft noises of hungry babies, and Thomas noticed how Margaret's attention immediately focused on their needs despite her nervousness about his decision. The entire wagon train seemed to hold its collective breath as Thomas approached the group that had gathered around his wagon. Families throughout the circle had paused in their preparations to watch the drama unfold, understanding instinctively that this moment would be remembered and discussed for years to come. "I've made my decision," Thomas announced, his voice carrying across the morning air with the authority that had made him a successful wagon train leader. "The boys need more than money or social advantages. They need someone who will love them, the way their mother would have loved them." Margaret felt her heart stop as she waited for Thomas to continue, afraid to hope but unable to prevent the surge of desperate longing that threatened to overwhelm her composure. "Margaret," Thomas said, turning to face her directly, "if you're willing to take on this responsibility, if you're certain you can care for them properly while completing this journey, then I want you to raise my sons as your own." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow of pure joy and terror combined. She was getting what she had longed for her entire adult life, but she was also accepting responsibility for two precious lives in circumstances that would challenge every skill and resource she possessed. "Yes," she whispered, then cleared her throat and spoke more firmly. "Yes, Thomas, I promise you they'll be loved and protected and raised to honor their mother's memory." James Campbell's face darkened with displeasure at losing what he had clearly considered a certain acquisition. "This is a mistake, Brennan," he said coldly. "You're letting sentiment override practical judgment. When that woman can't manage twin infants and her own survival in the mountains, don't expect the rest of us to rescue her." But Thomas had already turned away from Campbell, focusing instead on the legal and practical arrangements that would transfer custody of his sons to the woman who had convinced him that love mattered more than money. Margaret Holloway was about to become a mother to twin boys, whose care would test every assumption about what a woman traveling alone could accomplish on the most dangerous frontier in America. The leap of faith had been taken, and there would be no turning back. The transformation of Margaret Holloway's wagon from the practical conveyance of a traveling widow to the mobile nursery of twin infants happened with startling speed once Thomas's decision was announced. Within hours of accepting custody of the boys, Margaret found herself immersed in a world of constant needs, interrupted sleep, and challenges she had never imagined despite years of longing for motherhood. The first crisis came before they had traveled 5 miles from their morning campsite. Both twins began crying simultaneously, not the gentle mewling of hungry babies, but the sharp, distressed wails that signaled genuine discomfort or pain. Margaret had been walking beside her wagon to check on them every few minutes, but the sudden intensity of their cries sent her scrambling up onto the moving wagon bed, with her heart racing and her hands shaking with new mother panic. "What's wrong?" she whispered to the crying infants, her voice barely audible over their distress. "What do you need?" The practical reality of caring for newborns while maintaining the pace of a wagon train immediately became apparent. Margaret couldn't simply stop her oxen team to tend to the babies. The train moved as a unit, and individual wagons that fell behind risked being separated from the group's protection. She had to diagnose and solve whatever was troubling the twins, while her wagon continued bouncing and swaying over the rough prairie trail. Margaret's hands moved quickly over the first baby, checking for obvious problems. His diaper was dry, he showed no signs of fever, and he had been fed just an hour earlier. The second twin exhibited the same symptoms, distressed crying without apparent cause. It was Mrs. Patterson, riding alongside Margaret's wagon on horseback, who provided the solution. "Check their blankets for loose threads or pins," Mrs. Patterson called out over the noise. "Sometimes tiny things that adults barely notice can be torture for babies with sensitive skin." Margaret frantically examined the carefully crafted blankets that Sarah had sewn during the early months of pregnancy. In the corner of one twin's blanket, she found exactly what Mrs. Patterson had suspected: a loose thread that had worked its way around the baby's tiny toe, cutting off circulation and causing genuine pain. The thread was so fine that Margaret almost missed it, but once she carefully unwound it, the baby's cries immediately subsided to normal fussing. The second twin's problem proved more challenging to identify. His crying continued even after Margaret had thoroughly checked for physical irritants, and she began to worry that he might be developing one of the serious illnesses that could kill frontier infants within hours. It was only when she noticed that his cries intensified whenever the wagon hit a particularly rough patch of trail that she realized the problem. The makeshift cradle that Thomas had hastily constructed was not providing adequate cushioning. Against the constant jolting of travel, Margaret spent the next hour reorganizing the interior of her wagon while it continued moving, creating a more stable and comfortable sleeping area for the twins, using her own bedding and personal belongings as padding. The work was exhausting and frustrating, requiring her to solve complex logistical problems while maintaining her balance in a swaying wagon and keeping one eye on her oxen team to ensure they stayed with the train. By the time the wagon train stopped for its midday rest, Margaret was already discovering how dramatically her life had changed. Instead of the relatively leisurely break she had previously enjoyed, time to rest, eat a proper meal, and socialize with other families, she found herself immediately occupied with feeding, cleaning, and comforting two demanding infants who seemed to take turns needing attention. The feeding process alone proved more complicated than Margaret had anticipated. The twins were too young for solid food, requiring milk that had to be obtained from the wagon train's few dairy cows and carefully measured to ensure each baby received adequate nutrition. But cow's milk wasn't identical to human breast milk, and Margaret had to experiment with dilution and temperature to find a mixture that the babies could digest without developing stomach problems. Thomas approached Margaret's wagon during the midday stop, his expression showing both concern and guilt as he observed her frantic efforts to manage the twins' needs. "How are they doing?" he asked, though his voice suggested he could already see that the morning had been challenging. "They're healthy," Margaret replied, not looking up from the complex process of warming milk over her small campfire while simultaneously changing one twin's diaper with her free hand. "Just adjusting to their new circumstances, I think. Everything is strange for them. New smells, new sounds, new hands caring for them." Thomas watched silently as Margaret juggled multiple tasks, with the desperate efficiency of someone learning crucial skills under pressure. "Margaret, are you sure you can manage this? It's not too late to reconsider. The Campbell family would still—" "Thomas, no!" Margaret interrupted firmly, finally meeting his eyes. "I asked for this responsibility, and I'm not going to abandon it at the first sign of difficulty. These boys are my sons now, and I'm going to learn whatever I need to learn to care for them properly." But privately, Margaret was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had undertaken. The romantic vision she had harbored of gentle motherhood, rocking babies to sleep beside a campfire, teaching them about the world as they traveled toward their new home, bore little resemblance to the exhausting reality of constant vigilance and problem-solving that actual infant care required. The afternoon's travel brought new challenges that tested Margaret's determination and resourcefulness. One of her oxen, Belle, began showing signs of lameness that threatened to slow her wagon's pace and potentially separate her from the protection of the group. Under normal circumstances, Margaret would have dismounted to examine the animal and make whatever adjustments were necessary. But leaving the twins unattended in a moving wagon was not an option, and stopping the entire train for her personal problems would have been unconscionable. It was Robert Hayes who provided the solution, riding back from his position near the front of the train when he noticed Margaret's wagon beginning to lag. "What's the problem?" he called out as he approached. "Bells favoring her right front hoof," Margaret replied, grateful for any assistance. "I think she might have picked up a stone, but I can't leave the babies to check on her." Hayes immediately dismounted and jogged alongside Margaret's wagon, examining the limping ox with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with similar problems countless times during his years of frontier travel. "Definitely a stone," he confirmed, then moved to the front of the wagon team. "Hold up there, Buck," he said gently to the lead ox, bringing the wagon to a temporary halt. The stone removal took only a few minutes, but during that brief stop, both twins began crying again, apparently disturbed by the change in the wagon's motion that had become their new normal. Margaret found herself trying to comfort two distressed babies while monitoring Hayes's work on her ox and keeping track of the main wagon train's progress ahead of them. "This is going to keep happening," Hayes said quietly as they resumed travel. "Trail problems that require your full attention. Just when the babies need care, you might want to think about arranging some kind of partnership with another family, someone who could help with emergencies like this." Margaret nodded gratefully for the advice, but she also realized that finding such assistance might prove more difficult than Hayes suggested. Most families were already stretched thin, managing their own challenges, and taking on responsibility for someone else's infant twins represented a significant additional burden that few would willingly accept. The evening brought Margaret's first real test of managing the twins' needs while maintaining her own survival preparations. Setting up camp, which had previously been a straightforward process of unhitching oxen, starting a fire, and preparing dinner, became a complex juggling act that required constant attention to crying babies who seemed to sense that their caregiver was distracted. Margaret's first attempt at preparing dinner while caring for the twins resulted in burned cornbread and weak coffee that barely qualified as drinkable. The baby's feeding schedule didn't align with her own meal times, and she found herself eating cold food with one hand while holding a feeding bottle with the other. The simple act of obtaining milk from the communal herd became complicated by the need to either carry both infants with her or leave them unattended in the wagon. Neither option felt safe or practical. It was Mrs. Kowalski who finally took pity on Margaret's obvious struggles and offered assistance with the evening routine. "Dear, you're going to collapse from exhaustion before we reach the mountains if you keep trying to do everything yourself," the older woman said as she approached Margaret's campfire, where both twins were crying while Margaret frantically tried to prepare their evening meal. "I can manage," Margaret insisted, though her voice cracked with fatigue and stress. "I just need to figure out a better system for organizing everything." Mrs. Kowalski gently but firmly took one of the crying babies from Margaret's arms. "What you need is help, and there's no shame in accepting it. Here, let me hold this little one while you focus on getting their milk ready. You can't care for them properly if you don't take care of yourself too." The simple act of having someone else hold one twin while she attended to the other's needs made an enormous difference in Margaret's stress level. For the first time since accepting custody of the boys, she was able to complete a necessary task, without the constant background anxiety of crying babies demanding attention she couldn't provide. "Mrs. Kowalski," Margaret said as they worked together to feed and settle the twins for the night, "I want to ask you something honestly. Do you think I'm being foolish trying to raise these babies alone? Everyone keeps warning me about the difficulties ahead, and I'm starting to understand why. The older woman was quiet for a moment, studying Margaret's face in the flickering firelight. "I think you're being brave," she said finally. "Foolish might be the right word too, but sometimes the bravest things we do look foolish to people who've never had to choose between their hearts and their heads. Those babies need someone who wants them desperately, and that someone is you." Mrs. Kowalski paused, then continued more seriously. "But Margaret, you're going to need help. Regular help, not just emergency assistance. The trail ahead gets harder, not easier, and winter comes early in the mountains. If you're serious about keeping these boys, you need to start building a support network among the families who are willing to help." As Margaret finally settled the twins for their first night in her care, she reflected on the lessons the day had taught her. Motherhood wasn't the gentle, instinctive process she had imagined during her years of longing for children. It was a demanding, exhausting, sometimes overwhelming responsibility that required skills she was still learning and resources she was still discovering. But as she watched the twins sleeping peacefully in their carefully arranged bedding, their tiny faces relaxed in the trust that someone who loved them was keeping them safe, Margaret felt a fierce determination rising in her chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the mountain passes ahead would test every decision she had made about her capability to protect these precious lives. Yet for the first time in her adult life, Margaret Holloway felt complete. She was a mother now, with all the terrifying responsibilities and profound joys that title carried. The struggles were real, but so was the love that had driven her to fight for the right to experience them. The boys were hers now, and she was theirs. And together they would face whatever trials the frontier demanded of their unlikely family. 3 weeks after Thomas Brennan's decision, the wagon train had climbed steadily into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, where the October air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and the landscape transformed from rolling prairie to rugged terrain that demanded constant vigilance from every traveler. Margaret Holloway had settled into a rhythm of caring for the twins that bore little resemblance to the frantic improvisation of her first days as their mother. But the challenges had evolved rather than diminished as the boys grew stronger and more alert to their surroundings. The twins, whom Margaret had named William and Henry after her father and Daniel's grandfather, were thriving under her care in ways that surprised even the families who had expressed the strongest doubts about her ability to manage alone. William, the smaller of the two, had developed into a remarkably calm baby who seemed content to observe the world with serious dark eyes that reminded everyone of his mother Sarah. Henry, slightly larger and more demanding, possessed a vigorous cry that could be heard across the entire wagon circle when he decided that immediate attention was required. Margaret's transformation during those 3 weeks had been equally remarkable. The desperate uncertainty of her early mothering attempts had been replaced by the confident competence of someone who had learned to anticipate her children's needs and organize her life around their care without sacrificing her own survival or the wagon train's progress. She had developed systems for everything, feeding schedules that aligned with the train's rest stops, sleeping arrangements that allowed her to tend to the babies during the night without leaving her wagon, even a method for changing diapers while the wagon was in motion that other mothers on the train had begun copying for their own children. But Margaret's growing reputation extended far beyond her success as a mother. The medical skills that had originally attracted Thomas's attention to her suitability for raising his sons had become increasingly valuable as the wagon train faced the health challenges of mountain travel. The thinner air, colder temperatures, and more demanding terrain had resulted in a steady stream of injuries and illnesses that stretched the limited medical resources of the traveling community. It was Margaret who had successfully treated young, Timothy Kowalski's broken arm when the 12-year-old fell from his family's wagon while trying to retrieve a dropped water barrel. Working with materials scavenged from various families' supplies, she had fashioned a splint and sling that allowed the bone to heal properly while the boy continued traveling. Her patient explanation of bone-setting principles to Mrs. Kowalski had been so clear and thorough that the older woman had commented afterward that Margaret should consider establishing a medical practice once they reached Oregon Territory. When Reverend Morrison developed a persistent cough that threatened to progress into the kind of lung infection that killed elderly travelers on the frontier, it was Margaret who diagnosed the early stages of pneumonia and prescribed a treatment regimen that combined rest, warmth, and carefully prepared herbal remedies. She had organized a rotation of families to provide extra help with the Morrison wagon while the minister recovered, demonstrating leadership skills that complemented her medical knowledge. Most impressive to the other families was Margaret's response to a crisis that could have resulted in tragedy for multiple wagon train members. During a river crossing in the mountains, the Hayes wagon had become stuck on a submerged rock in the middle of the rushing current, with water rising rapidly around the stranded vehicle and threatening to sweep away both the wagon and its occupants. While most of the men focused on the immediate rescue effort, Margaret had quickly assessed the broader situation and realized that the delay was creating a dangerous backup of wagons on the riverbank. If the crossing wasn't completed quickly, several families would be forced to attempt the passage in darkness, significantly increasing the risk of additional accidents. "Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Kowalski," Margaret had called out, while simultaneously nursing Henry and organizing her own wagon's gear. "We need to get the remaining wagons across immediately while there's still daylight. Can you help coordinate the crossing order while the men work on freeing the Hayes wagon?" Margaret's calm leadership during the crisis had resulted in all families successfully reaching the opposite bank before sunset, avoiding what could have been a catastrophic night crossing. The Hayes family had been rescued without injury, and Robert Hayes himself had publicly credited Margaret's quick thinking with preventing additional accidents. These demonstrations of competence and leadership had gradually shifted Margaret's status within the wagon train community. She was no longer viewed as the impractical widow who had taken on more than she could handle, but as a capable and valuable member of the traveling group whose skills extended far beyond basic child care. Families began seeking her advice on medical problems, asking her opinion on logistical challenges, and including her in the informal leadership discussions that shaped the wagon train's daily decisions. The transformation was perhaps most evident in her relationship with the Campbell family. James Campbell, who had initially dismissed Margaret as an emotional woman making poor decisions, now found himself in the awkward position of requesting her medical assistance when his daughter Mary developed a severe case of what appeared to be scarlet fever. "Miss Holloway," Campbell had said stiffly as he approached Margaret's wagon one evening, his usual confidence replaced by parental anxiety, "Mary has developed a high fever and a rash that my wife cannot identify. We would appreciate your examination of her condition." Margaret had immediately set aside her own evening preparations to examine the sick child, despite Campbell's earlier hostility toward her adoption of the twins. Her diagnosis, not scarlet fever, but a severe allergic reaction to a new soap, Adelaide, Campbell had purchased at their last supply stop, had prevented the family from pursuing treatments that could have made Mary's condition worse. "Change her bedding completely and wash her skin with plain water and baking soda," Margaret had instructed, her professional manner showing no trace of resentment for Campbell's previous behavior. "Keep her cool and give her small sips of water frequently. The rash should begin fading within 24 hours if we've identified the cause correctly." Campbell's grudging thanks had marked a significant shift in their relationship, though Margaret suspected his attitude change was motivated more by pragmatic recognition of her value than genuine respect for her choices. The twins themselves had become beloved figures within the Wagon train community, their presence serving as a source of hope and continuity for families facing the daily uncertainties of frontier travel. Margaret had established a routine of evening walks around the Wagon circle, carrying the boys and allowing other families to interact with them, which had created bonds that strengthened the entire group's social fabric. 8-year-old Mary Campbell had become particularly attached to the twins, often spending her free time helping Margaret with simple tasks like organizing baby supplies or entertaining the boys when they were fussy. The child's gentle interactions with William and Henry had revealed a nurturing side of her personality that had been suppressed under her father's rigid expectations for proper behavior. "Miss Margaret," Mary had asked one evening as she helped fold the tiny clothes that Sarah had sewn during her pregnancy, "do you think William and Henry will remember their first mother when they get older?" Margaret had paused in her work, struck by the thoughtfulness of the question and the opportunity. It represented to help Mary process her own complex feelings about family relationships. "I think they'll carry something of her with them always," Margaret had replied carefully. "Maybe not specific memories, but the love she had for them before they were born. And I'll tell them stories about her as they grow up, so they'll know how much she wanted them and how happy she would be to see them healthy and loved." Mary had nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this explanation. "I think that's good," she had said. "Everyone should know they were wanted, even if sad things happened to their families." The conversation had reminded Margaret of her responsibility to preserve Sarah's memory for the boys and to ensure they grew up understanding the circumstances of their birth without feeling abandoned or unwanted. It was a delicate balance between honoring their biological mother and establishing her own maternal bond with them. Margaret's medical work had also evolved to include the specific challenges of infant health in frontier conditions. She'd become expert at identifying the early signs of dehydration, recognizing the symptoms of digestive problems that could quickly become life-threatening for babies, and managing the respiratory issues that developed when infants were exposed to the dust and temperature variations of mountain travel. When Mrs. Henderson's newborn daughter developed breathing difficulties during a particularly dusty day of travel, it was Margaret who recognized the signs of what she suspected was an early form of asthma triggered by environmental irritants. Her treatment, creating a makeshift humidifier in the Henderson wagon and adjusting the baby's position to ease breathing, had successfully managed the crisis until they reached clearer air at higher elevation. "You saved little Sarah's life," Mrs. Henderson had said tearfully after her daughter's breathing returned to normal. "I don't know what we would have done without your knowledge and quick thinking." These medical successes had established Margaret's reputation as someone who possessed not just theoretical knowledge, but practical skills that could mean the difference between life and death in frontier conditions. Families throughout the Wagon train had begun consulting her about health concerns, ranging from minor injuries to serious illnesses, creating an informal medical practice that operated alongside her responsibilities as a mother. The financial aspects of Margaret's new role had also evolved in unexpected ways. While she had originally planned to use her inheritance primarily for basic survival expenses and the costs of raising the twins, her medical work had generated a modest but steady income as grateful families insisted on compensating her for her services. The additional resources had allowed her to purchase better quality supplies for the boys and to contribute more substantially to the Wagon train's communal expenses. More importantly, Margaret's growing reputation as both a skilled healer and capable mother had begun attracting attention from people outside their immediate traveling group. When they encountered other westward-bound wagon trains at river crossings or supply stops, word of Margaret's abilities often preceded them, resulting in requests for medical consultations that further enhanced her standing within the broader community of Oregon Trail travelers. As November approached and the wagon train climbed higher into the Rocky Mountains, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when Thomas had announced his intention to auction his sons. She had gained not just the children she had always longed for, but also a sense of purpose and competence that extended far beyond motherhood. The scared, lonely widow who had joined the wagon train in Missouri had evolved into a confident professional, whose skills were valued and whose judgment was trusted by the families around her. But Margaret also understood that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. The mountain passes that would take them into Oregon territory were notoriously dangerous, especially for families traveling with young children. Winter weather could arrive without warning, trapping unprepared travelers in conditions that could kill them within hours. The boys were still vulnerable infants, whose survival would depend on her ability to protect them from dangers that experienced frontier families had learned to fear. Yet as Margaret prepared for sleep that night, listening to the quiet breathing of William and Henry in their carefully arranged bedding, she felt more confident about facing those challenges than she had ever felt about anything in her life. She had proven to herself and to the wagon train community that love could indeed triumph over practical disadvantages, that determination could overcome inexperience, and that the seemingly impossible could become not just possible, but successful, beyond anyone's expectations. Tomorrow would bring them closer to the most dangerous portion of their journey, but it would also bring them closer to the new life waiting for them in Oregon territory. Margaret Holloway had become everything she had dreamed of being: a mother, a healer, and a woman whose value was measured by her contributions rather than her limitations. The blizzard struck without warning on November 12th, transforming the Rocky Mountain Pass from a challenging but navigable route into a deadly trap that threatened the survival of every person in Thomas Brennan's wagon train. Margaret Holloway woke to the sound of wind howling like a living thing around her canvas wagon cover and the ominous weight of snow already accumulating on the fabric above her head. Beside her, in their carefully insulated cradle, William and Henry slept peacefully, unaware that they were facing the most dangerous circumstances of their young lives. Margaret had experienced frontier winters before, but nothing had prepared her for the brutal intensity of a high-altitude mountain storm. The temperature had plummeted overnight from merely cold to the kind of bone-deep freezing that could kill exposed travelers within hours. Worse, the snow was falling so heavily that visibility had been reduced to mere yards, making it impossible to see other wagons in their circle and eliminating any hope of continuing their descent toward the relative safety of lower elevations. The crisis began almost immediately when Margaret attempted to check on her oxen team. Buck and Belle, the steady animals who had carried her family safely across 1,000 miles of frontier, were showing signs of severe distress from the cold. Ice had formed around their nostrils, making breathing difficult, and their usual calm demeanor had been replaced by the restless anxiety of creatures sensing mortal danger. Margaret's attempts to provide additional shelter for the animals were hampered by the twins' needs. They had awakened hungry and cold, requiring immediate attention that she couldn't postpone even to address the livestock crisis. For the first time since adopting the boys, Margaret found herself facing a genuine conflict between their survival and her own, understanding with crystalline clarity that she might have to choose between protecting her children and maintaining the resources they all needed to complete their journey. The sound of shouting voices from other parts of the wagon circle indicated that similar crises were developing throughout the train. Margaret could hear Thomas Brennan's voice calling out orders as he moved between families, assessing their situations and trying to coordinate a response to the emergency. But even Thomas's experienced leadership was being tested by conditions that exceeded anything in his previous frontier experience. It was James Campbell who brought the most devastating news, his expensive boots crunching through the rapidly deepening snow as he approached Margaret's wagon with his face grim and his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. "Miss Holloway," Campbell called out over the wind, "we need to discuss the situation frankly. Several families are in immediate danger of losing their livestock to this storm. Without oxen teams, we'll have multiple wagons that can't continue the journey once this weather clears." Margaret bundled William and Henry more tightly in their blankets before stepping outside to face Campbell directly. The cold hit her like a physical blow, and she understood immediately why he looked so frightened. This wasn't just bad weather, it was the kind of storm that had trapped and killed entire wagon trains in previous years. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew where Campbell's thinking was leading. Campbell's response confirmed her worst fears. "The families with the best chance of survival need to pool our resources and livestock. Some wagons will have to be abandoned, along with anyone who can't contribute to the group's overall survival prospects. It's harsh, but it's the reality of our situation." Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Campbell was proposing exactly the kind of brutal triage that had always terrified frontier families, the deliberate abandonment of vulnerable members whose rescue would jeopardize everyone else's survival. As a single woman with infant twins, Margaret represented precisely the kind of burden that Campbell believed should be sacrificed for the greater good. "You're talking about leaving people to die," Margaret said flatly, her voice cutting through the wind with a clarity that made Campbell step back slightly. "I'm talking about making the hard choices that will keep the maximum number of people alive," Campbell replied, his tone defensive but determined. "Your situation, with 2 babies requiring constant care and attention, makes you a liability in circumstances like these. The resources needed to keep your family alive could save multiple other families instead." The confrontation that Margaret had sensed building for months was finally happening, but under circumstances far more dire than she had ever imagined. Campbell wasn't just questioning her right to raise the twins. He was arguing for her abandonment in conditions that would mean certain death for all 3 of them. "James Campbell," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength despite the howling. "Wind, I've spent the last month proving my value to this wagon train. I've treated injuries, prevented disasters, and contributed more to our collective survival than most families twice my size. If you think I'm going to accept abandonment based on your cowardly calculations, you're badly mistaken." Campbell's face flushed with anger at being called a coward, but before he could respond, other voices joined the conversation. Mrs. Kowalski appeared through the swirling snow, her round face fierce with protective anger. "James Campbell, you ought to be ashamed of yourself," Mrs. Kowalski declared, her Polish accent thickening with emotion. "Margaret Holloway has done more for this wagon train than you have with all your money and servants. If anyone should be abandoned for the good of the group, it's families who contribute nothing but demands and complaints." The argument quickly escalated as other families emerged from their wagons to join what was becoming a public confrontation about the wagon train's survival strategy. Robert Hayes appeared with Timothy Kowalski, whose arm Margaret had successfully treated weeks earlier. The Hendricks brothers emerged from their bachelor setup, followed by the Patterson family with their baby daughter, whose life Margaret had saved during the early weeks of travel. "Margaret stays," Robert Hayes said simply, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been Thomas's friend since childhood. "Anyone who suggests abandoning her and those babies can find their own way to Oregon." Samuel Patterson nodded vigorous agreement. Our daughter would be dead without Margaret's medical knowledge. We owe her our loyalty, not abandonment when things get difficult." But Campbell wasn't backing down from his position, and Margaret realized with growing alarm that he wasn't alone in his thinking. The Hutchinson family, who had originally wanted to adopt the twins themselves, were nodding agreement with Campbell's harsh assessment of the situation. "Sentiment won't keep us alive in this storm," Hutchinson called out over the wind. "We need to make rational decisions based on survival prospects, not emotional attachments. Single women with infants have the worst survival rates in frontier emergencies. That's just statistical reality." The confrontation was interrupted by Thomas Brennan's arrival, his face showing the strain of trying to manage multiple crises simultaneously while maintaining the leadership that 47 families depended on for their survival. Snow had accumulated on his coat and hat, and his boots left deep prints in the drifts that were already knee-deep around the wagon circle. "What's this about?" Thomas demanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who didn't have time for interpersonal conflicts during a life-threatening emergency. Campbell stepped forward to present his case. "Thomas, we need to face reality about our survival prospects. This storm could last for days, and our livestock and food supplies won't stretch to support everyone if we're trapped here. Some difficult decisions need to be made about resource allocation and who has the best chance of surviving to reach Oregon." Thomas's eyes moved from Campbell to Margaret, and she could see him calculating the same brutal mathematics that Campbell had presented. As wagon train captain, Thomas bore ultimate responsibility for maximizing the survival chances of the families who had trusted him with their lives. If Campbell's assessment was correct, if Margaret and the twins truly represented a drain on resources that could save other families, then Thomas might be forced to make the kind of decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly, "how much food and fuel do you have stored for yourself and the boys?" Margaret felt her heart racing as she realized this was her moment to prove that she deserved survival on merit rather than charity. 3 weeks of basic rations, plus medical supplies that I've been sharing with other families. My oxen are in better condition than most because I've been managing their feed carefully since we started climbing into the mountains. I have tools and equipment that other families have borrowed repeatedly, and I have skills that this group needs if we're going to have casualties from this storm." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression showing the complex calculations of a leader trying to balance practical survival needs against moral obligations. "What about the babies? How much additional burden do they represent?" Before Margaret could answer, an unexpected voice joined the conversation. 8-year-old Mary Campbell had appeared through the snow, her face red with cold and defiance as she confronted her own father. "Papa, you're being mean and stupid," Mary declared, her young voice carrying across the wagon circle with startling clarity. "Miss Margaret helped me when I was sick, and she helps everyone. William and Henry are just babies. They don't eat very much, and they make everyone happy when they're not crying. If you abandon them, you're just being selfish because you're scared." The child's words created a moment of stunned silence that was broken only by the howling wind. James Campbell's face showed shock and anger at his daughter's public defiance, but also something that might have been shame at having his motivations so clearly identified by an 8-year-old. It was Mrs. Henderson who provided the decisive argument, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose own infant daughter's life had been saved by Margaret's medical intervention. "Thomas," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "if we abandon Margaret and those babies, we're not making survival decisions. We're becoming the kind of people who sacrifice the vulnerable to save ourselves. That's not who we are, and it's not who we want to be when we reach Oregon territory. We stick together, or we're not worthy of the new life we're trying to build." The confrontation reached its climax as Thomas faced the fundamental test of his leadership. whether he would choose practical, survival calculations or moral principles when the two seemed to conflict. The decision he made would determine not just Margaret and the twins' fate, but the character of the community they were all trying to create in Oregon territory. Margaret stood in the swirling snow, holding her adopted sons against the brutal cold, surrounded by families who were arguing about whether her life was worth preserving. The moment crystallized everything she had fought for since joining the wagon train, the right to be valued for her contributions rather than dismissed for her circumstances, the principle that love and determination could overcome practical disadvantages, and the belief that a community's strength was measured by how it treated its most vulnerable members. The storm raged around them, but Margaret felt a calm certainty settling over her as she prepared to face whatever decision Thomas would make. She had proven her worth through months of service and sacrifice. Now she would discover whether that proof was enough to earn her family's survival when survival itself hung in the balance. The final test of Margaret Holloway's place in the wagon train community was about to be decided by a man who had once planned to auction her sons to the highest bidder, but who now held the power to determine whether love truly could triumph over fear when life and death hung in the balance. Thomas Brennan stood in the center of the wagon circle, snow accumulating on his shoulders as he faced the most critical decision of his leadership career. The wind continued to howl around them, but the immediate vicinity had grown unnaturally quiet as 47 families waited for him to determine not just Margaret's fate, but the moral foundation upon which their future community would be built. "Everyone back to your wagons," Thomas commanded, his voice cutting through the storm with the authority that had kept them alive for over 1,000 miles. "We'll discuss this properly when we're not all freezing to death in the open." But Margaret stepped forward before the group could disperse, understanding that this moment would define everything that followed. "Thomas, before you make any decisions about abandoning families, I want everyone to understand exactly what they're choosing." Thomas paused, recognizing the steel in Margaret's voice despite the brutal conditions. "What do you mean?" Margaret shifted William to her other arm, protecting him from the wind while maintaining eye contact with Thomas. "I mean that if you abandon me and the boys, you're not just making a practical survival decision. You're establishing that this community values some lives more than others, and that when things get difficult, the strong will sacrifice the weak to save themselves." James Campbell stepped forward aggressively, his face red with cold and anger. "We're talking about mathematics, not morality. Resources are finite and—" "No, James," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising above the wind. "We're talking about who we are, and I'm going to prove to every person here that I'm not the burden." "You think I am?" Without waiting for permission, Margaret began moving toward the edge of the wagon circle where the livestock were gathered. The other families followed, forming a procession through the deepening snow as Margaret led them to where the crisis was most evident. The scene that greeted them was worse than most had realized. Several oxen from different families were already showing signs of severe distress, their breathing labored and their movements sluggish with cold. 2 of the Hendricks brothers' animals had collapsed completely, and it was clear they wouldn't survive much longer without immediate intervention. "This is what we're really facing," Margaret announced, setting William down in Robert Hayes's arms while she moved toward the suffering animals. "Not a choice between strong families and weak ones, but a crisis that requires every skill and resource we have if any of us are going to survive." Margaret knelt beside the collapsed ox, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined the animal's condition. "Hypothermia and dehydration," she diagnosed quickly, "but salvageable. If we act fast, what happened next transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation." Margaret began issuing orders with the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done, and families throughout the wagon train responded with immediate cooperation that transcended the previous arguments about abandonment and survival. Mrs. Kowalski, I need every blanket you can spare and hot water if you can manage it. Mr. Patterson, help me get this animal into a more sheltered position. Hendricks brothers, start gathering materials to build windbreaks for the remaining livestock. Use wagon canvas, anything that will block this wind. As Margaret worked to save the dying ox, her medical knowledge proved invaluable in ways that extended far beyond human care. She directed the construction of emergency shelters that would protect the animals essential to everyone's survival, organized heating systems using shared fuel resources, and developed a triage system that prioritized the livestock most likely to survive with immediate intervention. Thomas watched this transformation with growing amazement. The woman James Campbell had characterized as a drain on resources was demonstrating leadership skills that exceeded those of most experienced frontier men. More importantly, her crisis management was actually improving the wagon train's overall survival prospects rather than diminishing them. "Margaret," Thomas called out as she successfully coaxed the collapsed ox back to its feet. "What do you need from the rest of us?" Margaret didn't pause in her work as she answered, "I need every family to contribute what they can to a central resource pool. Food, fuel, blankets, tools, everything we need to survive the next few days needs to be shared and managed collectively. And I need people to stop thinking about individual family survival and start thinking about community survival." The transformation that followed was remarkable. Families who had been arguing about abandoning the weak began working together with unprecedented cooperation, sharing resources and expertise in ways that multiplied their collective strength. Margaret's medical knowledge proved essential not just for treating the livestock, but for preventing human casualties as the storm continued to rage around them. When elderly Mrs. Morrison began showing signs of dangerous cold exposure, Margaret immediately recognized the symptoms and organized a warming protocol that involved multiple families, contributing body heat, hot drinks, and insulated clothing. Her quick intervention prevented what could have been the wagon train's first human casualty of the storm. The Hutchinson family, who had supported Campbell's abandonment proposal, found themselves benefiting directly from Margaret's expertise. When their youngest son developed severe frostbite on his hands, Margaret's treatment, involving careful rewarming techniques and pain management that prevented permanent damage, transformed Mr. Hutchinson's attitude completely. "I owe you an apology," Hutchinson said quietly, as Margaret finished bandaging his son's hands. "I let fear make me forget what kind of man I want to be. You're not a burden on this community. You're one of its most valuable members." But it was Margaret's handling of a potential disaster involving the Campbell family that truly demonstrated her character and competence under extreme pressure. Adelaide Campbell had attempted to prepare hot food for her family, using a poorly ventilated cooking setup inside their wagon, resulting in dangerous carbon monoxide buildup that threatened to kill the entire family in their sleep. Margaret detected the problem when she noticed James Campbell's disorientation and lethargy during one of her medical rounds, checking on families throughout the wagon circle. Without hesitation, she forced entry into the Campbell wagon despite James's confused protests, immediately recognizing the signs of carbon monoxide poisoning that could have killed the family within hours. "Get them outside immediately," Margaret commanded, her voice cutting through Campbell's confused objections. "Mrs. Patterson, help me carry Mary. She's barely conscious. Mr. Hayes, we need fresh air and warming blankets, but keep them outside until I can properly ventilate their wagon." Margaret's quick action saved the entire Campbell family from certain death, demonstrating exactly the kind of crisis intervention skills that made her invaluable to the wagon train's survival. As she worked to treat their symptoms and prevent permanent damage from the poisoning, even James Campbell could no longer deny her essential contribution to the community's welfare. The storm raged for 3 more days, but the wagon train survived. As a unified community, rather than a collection of individual families competing for resources. Margaret's leadership during the crisis had established new patterns of cooperation and resource sharing that strengthened their collective resilience in ways that extended far beyond the immediate emergency. Margaret herself proved that she could manage the twins' care even under the most extreme circumstances, developing innovative solutions that allowed her to contribute fully to the group's survival while maintaining her children's health and safety. She created a portable baby care system that allowed her to provide medical assistance throughout the wagon circle while keeping William and Henry warm, fed, and protected from the storm's dangers. The twins themselves became symbols of hope during the darkest hours of the crisis. Their presence reminded families of why they were fighting to survive, not just for themselves, but for the future generations who would inherit whatever community they managed to build in Oregon Territory. When Margaret carried the boys on her medical rounds, their innocent faces served as powerful reminders of what they were all working to protect. By the time the storm began to clear on the 4th day, the wagon train had been transformed from a collection of families traveling together into a genuine community bound by shared sacrifice and mutual dependence. Margaret's role in that transformation was undeniable, and even her strongest critics had been forced to acknowledge her essential value to their collective survival. Thomas Brennan gathered the families together as the first clear skies appeared over the mountain pass, his expression showing both exhaustion from the crisis and profound respect for what they had accomplished together. "We faced the worst test this trail can offer," Thomas announced to the assembled families, "and we survived because we remembered that our strength comes from taking care of each other, not from abandoning those who need help." He looked directly at Margaret as he continued, "Some of you questioned whether certain members of our community deserved protection during this crisis. I hope the last few days have answered that question definitively. Margaret Holloway didn't just earn her place. In this wagon train, she proved that our community is stronger because she's part of it." James Campbell stepped forward, his face showing genuine humility for the first time since Margaret had known him. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice carrying across the wagon circle. "I let fear make me forget the values that brought me west in the first place. Margaret, you saved my family's lives, and you did it after I tried to convince everyone to abandon you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway." Margaret looked at Campbell for a long moment, holding Henry against her shoulder while William slept peacefully in Mrs. Kowalski's arms. "James, forgiveness isn't something you have to earn," she said gently. "It's something we give, because we choose to build a community based on grace rather than judgment. We're going to be neighbors in Oregon Territory, and I'd rather start that relationship with friendship than resentment." The reconciliation that followed transformed the entire social dynamic of the wagon train. Families who had been divided by the survival crisis were reunited by their shared recognition of what they had accomplished together. Margaret's grace in victory, her willingness to forgive those who had threatened her family's survival, demonstrated the kind of leadership that would serve them well in the challenges that still lay ahead. As the wagon train prepared to resume its journey toward Oregon Territory, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning when Thomas had announced his intention to auction his sons. She had not just gained the children she had always longed for, she had discovered her own strength, proven her value to a community that had initially seen her as a burden, and helped establish the foundation for relationships that would shape their new life in the West. The mountains ahead still held dangers, and Oregon Territory would present new challenges that would test everything they had learned about cooperation and mutual support. But Margaret Holloway faced those challenges with complete confidence in her place within the community and her ability to protect and nurture the family she had fought so hard to claim. 5 years later, Dr. Margaret Holloway stood on the wraparound porch of her medical clinic in the thriving town of Willowbrook, Oregon Territory, watching her 5-year-old sons, William and Henry, chase chickens around the yard with the determined intensity that characterized everything they approached. The boys had grown into sturdy, confident children whose laughter could be heard throughout the small community that had formed around the original wagon train families who had chosen to settle together in the fertile Willamette Valley. The transformation of both Margaret's life and the community she had helped forge during that desperate mountain storm 5 years earlier was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a desperate flight from a grieving father's impossible choice had evolved into a thriving medical practice, a loving family, and a pioneering community that served as a model for other settlements throughout Oregon Territory. Margaret's clinic occupied the ground floor of a substantial 2-story house that she had designed and built with the help of families who remembered her life-saving interventions during their journey west. The building's upper floor contained living quarters for her family, while the main floor housed examination rooms, a surgical suite, and a pharmacy where she prepared the herbal remedies that had become famous throughout the territory for their effectiveness in treating frontier ailments. The morning brought Margaret's usual stream of patients, farmers with work-related injuries, mothers seeking advice about childhood illnesses, elderly settlers dealing with the chronic conditions that frontier life often aggravated. But it also brought something that had become increasingly common over the past 2 years: families traveling from distant parts of Oregon Territory specifically to consult with the woman whose medical reputation had spread far beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook. "Dr. Holloway," called Martha Stevens, a woman who had traveled 3 days from a settlement near the Columbia River, "I've brought my daughter Sarah to see you about the breathing troubles she's been having. We heard that you specialize in treating children with lung problems." Margaret smiled as she welcomed the Stevens family into her clinic, remembering the countless times during their wagon train journey when she had treated similar respiratory issues under far more primitive conditions. The medical knowledge that had originally attracted Thomas Brennan's attention to her suitability as a mother had developed into expertise that served families throughout the territory. Young Sarah Stevens's case proved to be a textbook example of childhood asthma triggered by environmental factors, a condition that Margaret had become expert at managing through a combination of herbal treatments, breathing exercises, and environmental modifications that allowed children to thrive, despite their respiratory challenges. The key is understanding that Sarah's breathing difficulties aren't a permanent limitation, Margaret explained to the worried mother, as she demonstrated the breathing techniques that would help the child manage her symptoms. With proper treatment and some adjustments to her environment, she can live a completely normal, active life. As Margaret worked with the Stevens family, she could hear William and Henry playing outside with the other children who had gathered for the morning lessons that she conducted 3 days a week. The informal school that had developed around Margaret's medical practice served not just her own sons, but also the children of families throughout the region who recognized the value of education in building Oregon Territory's future. The boys themselves had grown into remarkable children who reflected both their biological heritage and Margaret's nurturing care. William, still the more contemplative of the twins, had inherited his father Thomas's natural leadership abilities and often served as the organizer for the children's games and activities. Henry, more energetic and outgoing, possessed a curiosity about the natural world that reminded everyone of his mother Sarah's gentle intelligence. But both boys shared characteristics that clearly marked them as Margaret's sons: a compassionate concern for others' welfare, an instinctive understanding of medical principles that made them invaluable assistants in her clinic, and a confidence that came from growing up in a household where their contributions were valued and their questions were always taken seriously. Subi. Afternoon brought a visit that had become a monthly tradition. James Campbell and his daughter Mary, now 13 years old, arriving for what had evolved into a combination medical consultation and social visit that reflected the profound friendship that had developed between the families since that desperate mountain storm. Campbell himself had aged gracefully during their 5 years in Oregon Territory, his initial arrogance and calculating nature tempered by the experiences that had taught him the value of community cooperation over individual advantage. His business ventures had prospered, but he had learned to measure success by his contribution to the community's welfare, rather than purely by financial accumulation. "Margaret," Campbell said as he helped Mary down from their wagon, "I wanted you to know that the territorial legislature has officially approved the funding for the medical college in Salem. Your recommendation letter for the program was apparently quite influential with the Education Committee." Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction at this news. The establishment of formal medical education in Oregon Territory represented years of advocacy work that she had pursued alongside her clinical practice. Training the next generation of frontier doctors would ensure that communities throughout the territory would have access to the kind of medical care that could mean the difference between life and death in emergency situations. "That's wonderful news, James," Margaret replied. "And I suppose you'll be expecting Mary to consider the teacher training program they're planning to add." Mary Campbell had grown into a thoughtful, articulate young woman whose childhood attachment to Margaret's twins had evolved into a genuine interest in education and child development. Her experiences helping with the informal school at Margaret's clinic had revealed natural teaching abilities that suggested she could make significant contributions to Oregon Territory's educational development. "Actually," Mary said with the confidence that had characterized her since childhood, "I've been thinking about the medical college myself. Dr. Holloway, do you think women will be admitted to the program?" Margaret paused in her work, struck by the significance of Mary's question. The girl who had once defended Margaret's right to raise the twins was now considering following in her footsteps as a medical practitioner. It represented exactly the kind of expanded opportunity for women that Margaret had hoped their pioneering community might create. "I think the territorial legislature will learn that Oregon Territory needs every skilled medical practitioner it can train, regardless of gender," Margaret replied diplomatically. "And I think you would make an excellent Dr. Mary. You have the intelligence, the compassion, and the determination that the profession requires." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Brennan, now serving as Willowbrook's elected mayor and still maintaining his reputation as one of Oregon Territory's most respected community leaders. His monthly visits to check on his sons had become important social occasions that reinforced the bonds between all the families who remembered their shared struggles on the trail west. Thomas's relationship with Margaret had evolved into something that transcended the simple gratitude of a father whose children were being well cared for. He recognized her as a partner in raising William and Henry, someone whose wisdom and judgment he trusted completely when it came to decisions about the boys' education, health, and character development. "Margaret," Thomas said as he dismounted from his horse, "I have news that I think will interest you. The territorial governor has officially designated Willowbrook as a regional medical center, which means we'll be receiving federal funding to expand your clinic and establish satellite medical stations throughout the surrounding counties. Margaret felt her heart leap at this announcement. The expansion of medical services throughout the region had been a dream she had harbored since establishing her practice, but she had never imagined that official recognition and funding might make such growth possible. What would that mean practically? Margaret asked, her mind already racing through the possibilities for serving families in remote areas who currently had no access to medical care. It means you'd be responsible for training and supervising medical assistants who could provide basic care in outlying communities, Thomas explained. And it means the territorial government recognizes that the medical expertise you've developed here in Willowbrook represents a resource that should be shared throughout Oregon Territory. The afternoon's final visitor brought news that connected Margaret's present success to the humble beginnings of her journey toward motherhood. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson arrived with her 6-year-old daughter Emma, the baby whose life Margaret had saved during the early weeks of their wagon train journey, and a letter that had traveled across the continent to reach them. This came from a family in Missouri, Mrs. Patterson explained, as she handed Margaret the carefully folded papers. They heard about your medical practice through relatives who knew people from our original wagon train. They're asking for advice about organizing their own westward journey, and specifically whether they should attempt the trip with elderly family members and young children. Margaret read the letter with growing emotion, recognizing in the distant family's questions the same hopes and fears that had driven her own decision to join Thomas Brennan's wagon train 5 years earlier. They were seeking not just practical advice about frontier travel, but reassurance that love and determination could overcome the challenges that seemed insurmountable to people facing such a journey alone. "What will you tell them?" Mrs. Patterson asked as Margaret finished reading. Margaret looked around at the thriving community that surrounded her clinic, at the children playing in the yard who represented the future of Oregon Territory, at the friends whose lives had been intertwined with hers through shared struggles and triumphs that had forged bonds stronger than family ties. "I'll tell them that the most important thing they can bring west isn't money or equipment or even experience," Margaret said finally. "It's the willingness to help each other, to see challenges as opportunities to prove what communities can accomplish when they work together, and to remember that the people who seem like burdens often turn out to be the ones who save everyone else." As evening approached and the day's activities wound down, Margaret gathered William and Henry for the bedtime routine that had become one of her most treasured daily rituals. The boys had grown old enough to understand the basic story of how they had come to be her sons, and they often asked questions about their birth parents and the circumstances that had brought their family together. "Mama Margaret," William said, as she tucked him into bed, "do you think our first mama would be happy about how we're growing up?" Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever the boys asked about Sarah. She had worked hard to ensure that they grew up knowing they were loved by both their birth mother and their adoptive mother, and that Sarah's death was a tragedy that didn't reflect any lack of love for them. "I think she would be very proud of the kind, intelligent, caring boys you've become," Margaret replied honestly. "And I think she would be grateful that you've had the chance to grow up in a community where you're valued for who you are, not limited by what other people think you should be." Henry rolled over to face Margaret, his expression serious in the way that reminded her powerfully of Thomas. "And Papa Thomas is happy that we live with you instead of with him." Margaret smiled at the question that reflected the boys' ongoing efforts to understand the complex family relationships that had shaped their lives. "Papa Thomas made the choice he made because he loves you and wanted you to have the best possible life. He knew that I could give you the daily care and attention that you needed, while he could give you guidance and wisdom as you grow up. We're all part of the same family, just organized in a way that works for everyone." As Margaret completed the evening routine and prepared for sleep herself, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from the desperate widow who had joined a wagon train with nothing but her medical knowledge and her longing for children, to the respected doctor and mother who had helped establish a thriving community in Oregon Territory. The twins, sleeping peacefully in their beds, represented far more than the personal fulfillment of her maternal dreams. They were symbols of what could be accomplished when people chose love over fear, when communities valued cooperation over competition, and when individuals had the courage to fight for what they believed was right, rather than accepting what others told them was practical. Outside her window, the lights of Willowbrook twinkled in the darkness, each one representing a family whose life had been touched by the medical care, educational opportunities, and community spirit that had grown from the seeds planted during that desperate mountain storm 5 years earlier. Margaret Holloway had achieved everything she had dreamed of when she made her desperate proposal to Thomas Brennan beside his wagon on that October morning that seemed like a lifetime ago. She had become a mother, a healer, and a community leader whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of her own family. But more importantly, she had helped prove that the seemingly impossible could become not just possible, but triumphant. That love could indeed triumph over practical obstacles, and that the courage to fight for what mattered most could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The Barren woman who had intervened to save twin babies from being auctioned had become the mother, doctor, and leader whose legacy would shape Oregon Territory for generations to come. In saving William and Henry, Margaret Holloway had ultimately saved herself, and in the process she had helped create a community that embodied the best possibilities of the American frontier. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.